Welcome back. We're going to start the second part of the male anatomy lecture. I want to talk about how the sperm cells are transported through the network of ducts and glands of the male reproductive system. So we have several structures to introduce, and we'll work our way up to tracing the pathway that sperm cells have to take to exit the male reproductive system. So last time we got a good education on what the testes were, right? Remember, these are the site of sperm cell production. Within them, we have our seminiferous tubules. So those were the individual structures, these little coiled tubules that are within, right, the individual lobules, these little dividing areas of the testes. As those sperm cells are produced within the seminiferous tubules, within the walls, we know they let go, right, and travel through the lumen. So everything is flowing in this general direction within the seminiferous tubules toward a structure called the rete testes, R-E-T-E-T-E-S-T-I-S, if we're talking about one testes. From the rete, this is where all of the mature sperm cells are going to go, and then they're going to head into the next structure, the epididymis. From the epididymis, they're going to move on their pathway into something called the ductus deferens. And I need to switch over to this larger figure here. Okay, so we can say we're about here with the ductus deferens. So then we're about here in this image. And we move through that hollow tube. We're going to encounter what's called the ejaculatory duct, and then we're going to travel through the male urethra and out the body. So this lecture is going to focus on some of the additional features of those structures. Let's focus on the epididymis. So we just followed that pathway of those sperm cells from their individual seminiferous tubules into the rete, and now they're into the epididymis. The way that you can remember the epididymis as a separate structure from the testes is breaking down a little bit of its name. So the Greek and Latin roots that are hidden within here, the term epi, E-P-I, epi means upon or on top of. So when we think about this structure, the epididymis, it's upon or on top of the testes. It has three pieces. It's got the top portion is referred to as the head, the middle portion is referred to as the body, and the bottom portion is referred to as the tail of the epididymis. So even though we referred to producing a mature spermatozoa cell within the seminiferous tubules, they're not totally ready to go at this point. They need to improve their swimming skills. So the epididymis is where we send mature sperm to learn how to swim. Again, we describe the whole maturation process from start to finish as taking 2 to 3 months. We can account for about 2 weeks of that time as the transit time through the head, body, and tail of the epididymis. At this point, we can think of the sperm cells as floating, so they're just acquiring their swimming skills, but they are not going to use them yet. The greater journey that they need to take is in the female reproductive system. So they're going to save their strength, their energy, and they're not going to use their new skills until they get there. So we can think of the sperm cells as floating through these hollow tubes, and at some points they're even being pushed by the muscle layers within the tube. That's really going to be the job of the next structure, the ductus deferens. We've switched our view here. We've zoomed out a little bit further so we can reorient ourselves to the figure. We can see the testes is here. The epididymis is on top. Okay, and now we're going to look at some of these other structures. So the next place that the testes go are within the ductus deferens, this structure here. And this is a good time to introduce not just the ductus deferens, but also the entire structure, which is known as the spermatic cord. So we can see in this part of the image, the spermatic cord is simply this long tube-like structure that is suspending not just the testicle from the body, but it is protecting the ductus deferens, this tube that allows for passage of sperm cells through the male reproductive tract. But we can also see that there is a red structure in here, an artery. We can see that there is a blue network in here, the pampiniform plexus, the veins, and then there's always going to be a yellow structure. Right? This is going to be the nerve that is supplying information to and from the testes. So all of those things wrapped up together, the ductus deferens, the blood vessels, okay, and the nerve, those all get wrapped together in something called the cremaster muscle, okay, that protect and identify and distinguish what is the spermatic cord. You don't have to worry too much about specifically the name of the artery or the vein. I just want you to be aware that the testes, just like any other part of the body, needs supporting structures. It needs information from the nervous system. It needs a blood supply from the cardiovascular system, and it's all wrapped up neatly in that muscle, the cremaster muscle. Let's now take a better look at the ductus deferens. So we're switching our views once again. We're back to that sagittal section, which is kind of a cut right through the middle of a body. So we're able to, in this view, now again, we can see the testicle from the side, the epididymis, and then here's our ductus deferens again. So we can see that this is a very long tube. Here's the portion that was contained within the spermatic cord. All right, so you can just abbreviate that there, SC for spermatic cord. But let's focus on the fact that it travels back up inside the male body. It wraps around, which is known as the urinary bladder. And then it's actually cut off a little bit here. It comes around the back of the urinary bladder to connect up with something called the ejaculatory duct. And that leads into the next set of ducts, which are contained within the prostate gland. That's what this little chestnut-shaped incised gland is. We can draw our attention to this view, which is really just more of the same structures, but this is from a posterior view, otherwise known as the back. So if you had X-ray vision and you were looking through the back of somebody and you could see into that part of their body, right? Now we can see the urinary bladder for reference, and we can see the back part of that ductus deferens, which kind of gets trimmed off on the other figure, leading into the ejaculatory duct labeled on this figure. So now we have a full picture. We just had to use 3 different views to kind of rotate around. Think of the ductus deferens as a muscular tube. Again, the sperm cells are going to want to save their energy, so they're going to be pushed by the muscle in that hollow tube. Right? They're not going to swim. Another feature that we should be aware of is just the fact that the back of that ductus deferens, right before it heads into the ejaculatory duct, it widens out. So this part of the figure here, this is called an ampulla. An ampulla is just a funnel-shaped structure, and this is where we're going to store some of our mature sperm. Okay? Whenever we go through the male sexual response cycle, when we ejaculate and release semen from the male reproductive system, okay, this is where we're going to keep the sperm that is most ready to go. It's going to be just upstream from the ejaculatory duct. Again, remember, it takes 2 to 3 months to make mature sperm cells. These are the guys that are at that 2 to 3 month point. They are mature and ready. Let's keep going on this pathway. Let's take a look at the male urethra. Now, this is going to be relatively complicated. There are actually 3 parts to the male urethra. Okay, now we're looking at yet another view. Okay, this is a frontal section through some of these organs that we've seen before. We've removed some of the detail so that we can focus in. So if you had your bearings with that last view, it was a posterior view of the urinary bladder, and you can kind of see through here if you use your little bit of an X-ray vision, we can see on the back of the bladder, the ductus deferens and the ampulla there, and then we're coming into the ejaculatory duct. So this is just a flip now. We're looking at the front of the body and just focusing on these structures. The male urethra is long, and I describe it as a shared structure because it shares its function with the urinary system. Men urinate or release urine through their urethra, as do females. But unlike women, men also have this second function where they're going to release semen, which is going to be the combination of sperm cells and some other fluids that are produced in accessory glands of the male reproductive system. So we've got two jobs, one tube. So we need to think about that and divide it up a little bit. Let's start with the first part up at the top. This is the prostatic urethra. So we'll just introduce again the prostate gland, which sits right below the male urinary bladder, and the urethra that passes through the center of the prostatic gland and meets up with that ejaculatory duct is going to be called the prostatic urethra. From there, we have another portion, which is called the membranous urethra. And it's the shortest portion. It's just this little bit here, which is crossing through the body wall. If you think of a human body, at some point you really get to the bottom of the abdominal cavity, right? And then the legs are below that. So we have this urogenital floor or body wall where there's just a couple layers of muscle and then there's really no more structures there. So that membranous urethra is just coming through those layers of muscle that make up that pelvic floor or urogenital floor, whatever you want to call it. Finally, then we'll transition into the spongy urethra. Okay, the spongy urethra travels through the penis. The reason we call it the spongy urethra is, we'll get to this when we talk about the anatomy of the penis a little bit more, but the tissue contained within the penis is very spongy. Okay, so this tissue here is called the corpus spongiosum, spongy body. So the spongy urethra is contained within the spongy tissue of the penis. Use those little associations to help you. All right, since we've made it all the way out of the body, at this point we can do this activity, which is tracing the path of sperm cells through the male reproductive tract. So I think this is a really good place to stop and test your knowledge. I hope you've been taking your own notes at this point. So what I would highly recommend for you to do before you watch the rest of this video where I trace the path of sperm through the male reproductive tract, see if you can now pull out a blank sheet of paper, see if you can draw the structures that are on this list, see if you can cover up their names and see if you can spell them correctly. That's an even better test. And see if you can label everything out. If you can do that, then you're in pretty good shape for this part of the exam. So go ahead, test yourself now, pause the video, and then when you're ready to restart, I'll begin drawing. All right, let's begin with the site of sperm production. So let's go ahead and draw. I'm just going to draw a single testis. We'll go ahead and label that there. I know within my testis, I'm going to have a network of seminiferous tubules. I'll just draw one. I'm going to just do that and label it that way, rather than writing out the word seminiferous tubule. I highly encourage you to write. It's just a little bit challenging for me with the screen. Okay, so we've got one seminiferous tubule in there. And we know that all of those seminiferous tubules come together at the back of the testy, that structure that is called the reach. And then from that, we're going to move into our next structure, okay, the epididymis. The epididymis is a separate structure, so I will use a separate color and draw the head, body, and tail of my epididymis. Okay, so that's our next structure, the epididymis. I'm just going to abbreviate it epi for now. Then we'll go ahead and move on to our next structure that sperm travels through, which is the ductus deferens. So we know that this loops out and makes quite the journey back into the male reproductive system. Okay, it's a hollow tube, so I better draw both sides of it so that I remember that it is a hollow tube. And I'm going to make that last portion a little bit wider because we know that there is that ampulla shape. Okay, so that is my ductus deferens. You may have heard in older textbooks that structure called a vas deferens. The prefix vas refers to blood vessels. So you can imagine originally whenever they were looking at the spermatic cord, it got really easy to confuse an artery, a vein, and the ductus deferens. So at first it probably just looked like another artery to them. It is not. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and draw, before I put the ejaculatory duct in, I'm going to put the prostate gland in. Okay, so here is my prostate. And within the prostate, we know we have this ejaculatory duct. Yep. That we can see there. That is where the ductus deferens is emptying into. From that, we know, from that ejaculatory duct, now we know we're in the center of the prostate gland. So we'll label this the prostatic urethra. I'll switch colors again to identify the membranous urethra. Remember, this is just the urogenital or pelvic floor where all of those muscles, right, that create the bottom of the body are existing. So that's going to be our membranous urethra. And then finally, the last thing we need to draw is our spongy urethra. The spongy urethra is going to be contained within the penis. Remember, we'll talk about the penile tissues whenever we get to that portion. But that's essentially the outlet. So the spongy urethra is right here. And then the external urethral orifice, an orifice is simply a hole or an outlet. So that's going to be really the end of the line in the male reproductive tract. Okay, so please make sure you do some drawing. Make sure you write out the names of those structures. It's going to make the test very easy if you can take those types of notes and have that type of recall and practice.